The hospital room was thick with the scent of sterile alcohol and the heavy, silent weight of impending loss when Mrs. Ton reached out with a strength that defied her frail frame. She gripped Dauton's hand, her eyes locking onto his with a clarity that pierced through his hardened exterior. With a trembling finger, she pointed across the room toward a nurse checking the monitors, a woman with short, natural curls, warm skin, and a calm, confident smile. "That one," his mother rasped, her voice barely a whisper against the hum of the heart monitor. "I want her." Dauton, a man who commanded a sprawling criminal empire with a single word, felt a rare flicker of confusion cross his sharp features. He looked from the nurse back to his mother, his eyebrows raised in shock. "For what, Uma? You need a better doctor, not a new nurse." "For you, my son," she replied, her gaze unyielding. "I am dying, and I refuse to let you leave this world bitter and hollow like your father. Before I go, I want to see you actually love someone. I want to see you let someone in." In that moment, the man whose neck tattoos were a warning to the entire soul underworld felt a sensation he had buried nearly 2 decades ago, a spark of terrifying, genuine hope. The fluorescent lights of the ICU buzzed with a rhythmic 2 a.m. drone. Dauton sat rigid in a cramped plastic chair, the midnight black fabric of his luxury suit jacket looking starkly out of place against the sterile, peeling white walls of the ward. He was the most feared leader in the city, a man built on calculated violence, yet here he was merely a son facing a final, impossible negotiation. The fluorescent lights of Seoul National Hospital's intensive care unit hummed with a sterile 2 a.m. persistence that felt like a personal insult to the silence. Dao Tan sat rigid in a cramped plastic chair, his posture as sharp and uncompromising as the blade he usually carried tucked against his ribs. His midnight black luxury suit jacket looked violently out of place against the peeling, antiseptic white walls. To the world outside these sliding glass doors, Dao Tan was a name spoken in hushed tones across shipping docks and smoke-filled private clubs, a man who had inherited a throne of iron and blood at only 19. He moved cargo that wasn't listed on manifests and commanded loyalty that was bought with unwavering precision. But inside this room, his empire was worth less than the saline dripping into his mother's arm. Mrs. Tan lay small and swallowed by the patterned hospital blankets, her breathing a shallow, rhythmic struggle that the monitors tracked with cold indifference. The pancreatic cancer had been a silent thief, moving through her until the once vibrant woman was reduced to something paper-thin and translucent. Dao leaned forward, his jaw tight enough to ache, his fingers closing around her hand with a protective desperation. He was the most feared man in the underworld, a human weapon forged in the fires of territory disputes and quarterly earnings. Yet he could not negotiate a single extra hour of life for the only person who had ever seen his heart instead of his power. "Dao Ta-na," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the mechanical whir of the ward. "I'm here, Uma," he replied, his voice dropping into a register reserved only for her. He watched her eyes, still sharp despite the haze of the morphine, as they tracked a figure moving with practiced grace across the unit. Ella Miller moved between the beds of the dying with a composure that suggested she wasn't afraid of the dark. Her natural curls were pulled back, her warm skin glowing even under the harsh, unflattering glare of the hospital lights. She hummed a soft, wordless melody as she checked an IV line, her hands gentle and sure. "That one," Mrs. Tan said again, her grip on Dao's hand tightening with a sudden, startling surge of intent. "I want her for you." Dao looked at the nurse and then back to his mother's fierce, knowing eyes. He saw the determination of a woman who knew her time was measured in heartbeats and refused to leave her son to the cold, lonely fate of his father. In his world, kindness was a calculation and vulnerability was a death sentence. but as he watched Ella offer a genuine, tired smile to a patient in the next bay, the walls he had built around his life felt unexpectedly fragile. For the first time in 15 years, the boss of the city's most dangerous syndicate considered doing something absolutely reckless. The heavy silence of the ICU was broken an hour later by the soft squeak of rubber soles against linoleum. Dao Tan stood as Ella Mitchell approached his mother's bedside, his shadow stretching long and imposing across the sterile floor. Most people in Seoul diverted their eyes when he moved, sensing the jagged edges of a man who dealt in ultimatums. But Ella didn't even flinch when he intercepted her path. Up close, her amber eyes were steady, flecked with gold, and entirely devoid of the frantic submission he was used to. "Miss Miller," he said, his voice a low grate that usually commanded immediate silence. "Mr. Tan," she replied, her tone professional yet layered with a surprising grounded warmth. She didn't retreat from his proximity. Instead, she adjusted the stethoscope around her neck and moved past him to check his mother's vitals with practiced, gentle hands. "Your mother is a fighter, but you already know that." Dao studied her, his gaze lingering on the way she handled the woman who was his only remaining anchor to humanity. "My mother, if she embarrassed you earlier with her talk, I apologize," he managed, the words feeling stiff and foreign on his tongue. Ella offered a small, knowing smile that didn't quite reach the level of a laugh, but softened the sharp lines of the room. "She didn't embarrass me. She loves you. That's rare in a place like this." She paused, her gaze finally meeting his with a clinical yet deeply human curiosity. "Most people in your position hire staff to sit these vigils. They don't stay for 3 days straight without sleeping." "What makes you think I'm in any particular position?" he asked, his posture shifting into something more predatory, more defensive. Ella tilted her head, unimpressed by the change in his energy. She gestured vaguely toward the door where his security detail stood like stone statues. "The men outside, the suit that costs more than my college degree. But mostly," she stepped closer, her voice dropping, "the way you carry yourself, like you're waiting for the world to challenge you so you can break it." Dao felt a strange, cold jolt in his chest. She saw him, not as a boss, not as a monster, but a man hiding behind a very expensive cage. "And yet you aren't afraid," he observed. "I've worked ERs long enough to know that fear doesn't save anyone," she said quietly, her composure unshaken by his tattoos or his reputation. "Besides, your mother asked me to look at your heart. I'm still looking." The heavy, clinical scent of the ICU finally became unbearable to Dao Tan, a man who usually thrived in the stifling air of backroom deals. He waited until Ella had finished her rounds, catching her near the nurse's station where the light was just a little too bright for a man with his history. "Have coffee with me," he said, the command coming out more like a challenge than an invitation. Ella paused, her hand hovering over a chart. She looked at him, really looked at him, her amber eyes tracing the sharp line of his jaw and the tattoos peeking from his collar. "That's unexpected," she noted, her voice remains calm. "Why?" "My mother is dying," Dao admitted, the words feeling like jagged glass in his throat. "Her last wish is to see me let someone in. I figure the least I can do is try." Ella blinked, a small, incredulous smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "That is quite possibly the most terrible reason I've ever heard to ask someone out." "Then I'll give you a better one." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous vibration that made the air between them feel thin. "Because when you smiled at her, I remembered what it felt like to be human, and I'd like to explore that." The silence that followed was measured in the soft beeps of distant heart monitors. "1 coffee," Ella finally whispered, her defiance softening into something like curiosity. "But I choose the place, and your men stay in the car." The location Ella selected was a tiny, nameless hole in the wall in a cramped alleyway of Hongdae, worlds away from the glass and steel luxury Dao Tan inhabited. The furniture was mismatched, the indie music was too loud, and the air smelled of burnt espresso and old books. Dao sat on a rickety wooden chair that felt like it might snap under the weight of his suit, his presence drawing nervous glances from the university students nearby. "You don't like it," Ella stated, leaning forward over her steaming mug. She had traded her scrubs for jeans and a soft sweater, her natural curls framed by the warm glow of a nearby lamp. "I prefer places where people don't stare," he grunted, glancing at his bodyguard, Kale, who was visibly struggling to look inconspicuous by the door. "They aren't staring at you, Dao. They're staring at the mountain of a man you brought as a +1, she teased, her eyes sparkling with a mirth he didn't know how to mirror. "Now tell me, is this a date, or are you just fulfilling a contract for your mother?" Dao looked at her, at the way she didn't seem to care about his power or his money, and felt a strange, unfamiliar pulse of heat crawl up his neck. "If I say it's a date, will you run?" "Depends," said Ella, her expression turning serious. "Are you going to be honest about what you really do? Because I've worked in Chicago ERs long enough to recognize a man who carries the weight of a city on his shoulders." Dao stared into his black coffee, the reflection of the neon sign "Open" shimmering on the surface. He could lie, he should lie, but as he looked at Ella, he realized his mother had been right. This was a negotiation that required his heart, not his head. The steam from the mismatched mugs curled between them, a fragile veil in the dimly lit cafe. Dao Tan watched Ella, waiting for the shift in her expression, the moment the intrigue would turn to the familiar, jagged edge of fear. He leaned back, the wood of the rickety chair creaking under his weight, and slowly reached for his collar. With a deliberate movement, he loosened his tie and unbuttoned the top of his dress shirt, revealing the intricate dark ink that climbed from his chest and wrapped around his throat like a permanent shadow. "You asked for the truth," he said, his voice a low, gravelly resonance that seemed to vibrate through the small table. "I don't just run a business, Ella. I run an organization. Import and export are the surface, but we operate in the gray areas of this city. Sometimes the areas are entirely black." Ella's gaze didn't waver. She leaned in, her eyes tracing the sharp lines of the tattoos on his neck. "The Western world has a word for it," she whispered, the syllable hanging heavy in the air. "Mafia?" "Essentially, yes," Dao replied, his jaw tightening as he braced for her to stand up and walk out of the door. "In Seoul, we are the law that people pray they'd never have to encounter. My life is built on debt, territory, and the kind of loyalty that is signed in blood." He waited for the disgust, the inevitable retreat of a woman whose entire life was dedicated to healing. Instead, Ella reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from the ink on his skin. "I'm not naive, Dao Tan," she said softly, her amber eyes searching his. "I've worked in Chicago ERs. I've seen the aftermath of the world you live in. I know there are monsters in the dark." She paused. Her gaze dropped to his hands, the hands that had held his mother's with such fragile, desperate care for 3 days straight. "But I also know that a monster doesn't sit vigil for a dying woman until he's gray with exhaustion. A monster doesn't look at his mother with the kind of soul-deep ache I saw in that hospital room." Dao felt a strange, sharp pang in his chest, a sensation more piercing than any physical wound. He was a man who dealt in certainties and power, yet she was looking past the dangerous aura he used as armor, searching for a heart he wasn't sure he still possessed. "My grandmother used to say that fear and love often wear the same face," Ella continued, her voice steady and unafraid. "Your mother didn't point at you because she wanted me to see a boss. She pointed because she wanted me to see the man behind the tattoos. So, I'm looking." Under the flickering neon light of the Hongdae alley, the most feared man in the underworld realized he was no longer the one in control of the negotiation.
For the first time, he wasn't being obeyed, he was being seen.
The 3 weeks that followed were a beautiful, fragile blur, a collection of stolen hours between Ella's shifts and late-night phone calls that stretched until the Seoul skyline began to bleed into dawn. Tan found himself navigating a world he didn't recognize, trading territory disputes for the quiet hum of a hospital corridor, and learning the subtle differences between a latte and a cappuccino just to see Ella's eyes light up. His mother's condition had stabilized just enough for her to be moved to a private room, where the air was less sterile and more like a sanctuary. She watched them with knowing, sharp eyes, her strength waning, but her spirit finally at rest. "You're falling for her," Mrs. Tan whispered one afternoon in Korean, her voice a fragile rasp as she watched Ella laugh at something Deo had said. "It's only been 3 weeks, Uma," he murmured, adjusting the blanket over her paper-thin legs. "Time doesn't measure love, my son. Depth does," she replied with a weak, peaceful smile. "And I see how you look at her, like she's water and you've been dying of thirst." The end came on a quiet Tuesday, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the room in hues of soft amber and gold. Tan sat on one side of the bed, his large, tattooed hand enveloping his mother's, while Ella sat on the other, her presence a steady, grounding force. Mrs. Tan looked between them, her gaze lingering on the way their hands occasionally brushed, an unspoken alliance formed in the shadow of loss. "Smart girl," she whispered, her eyes finding Ella's one last time. "She has fire." "Too much fire," Deo muttered, though the corners of his mouth twitched with a rare, aching tenderness. "Just enough," his mother corrected softly. She let out a long, shuddering breath, her fingers giving Deo's hand one final, meaningful squeeze. "I can go now, my son, knowing you won't be alone. I got my wish. I saw you love someone. I saw someone love you back." Her eyes drifted closed, the tension finally leaving her face as the frantic beep of the heart monitor slowed into a single, eternal note. In the heavy silence that followed, Tan didn't reach for his phone to call his lieutenants or his security detail. Instead, he reached across the bed for Ella's hand, clinging to the only living thing that could see the heart his mother had died to save. The grief following Mrs. Tan's funeral was a heavy, suffocating shroud, but for Tan, there was no time for the luxury of mourning. The vacuum left by his mother's passing had invited a chill into the Seoul underworld that had nothing to do with the weather. He sat in his glass-walled office overlooking Gangnam, his eyes fixed on a spread of surveillance photographs that made his blood turn to ice. There was Ella leaving the hospital after a double shift, Ella at the grocery store, and most damningly, Ella laughing at a street food stall while Dao tucked a stray curl behind her ear. "The shadow vipers," Kayal said quietly, leaning against the heavy mahogany door. His right-hand man didn't need to explain the gravity of the situation. The Vipers were a splinter syndicate, young and hungry, with a reputation for targeting the things their enemies loved most. "They've been tailing her for 6 days. They know she's your weakness, boss." Tan's hands clenched into white-knuckled fists, the tattoos on his fingers stretching over his joints. "How many men do we have on her?" "If we put a visible security detail on her, we confirm she matters," Kayal countered, his voice dropping into a tone of grim pragmatism. "Right now, she's a curiosity. A full escort makes her a trophy. You know how this ends, Dao. There is only one logical way to protect a civilian in this game." Kayal stepped closer, his expression softening with a rare flash of pity for the man he had served for a decade. "End it. Walk away. Make her irrelevant before they decide to make her a message." The words hit Dao with the force of a physical blow. It was the safe choice, the choice his father would have made without a second thought. He looked at a photo of Ella's tired, beautiful smile, remembering his mother's dying plea to negotiate with his heart. Walking away felt like a different kind of death, a return to the bitter, cold vacuum he had inhabited for 15 years. But as he watched the grainy footage of a black sedan following Ella's bus, the weight of his empire felt like a lead weight dragging them both toward the bottom of the Han River. He realized that by letting her in, he hadn't just given himself a heart, he had given his enemies a bullseye. The night air at the Han River was biting, a cold that seeped through even the heavy wool of Dao Tan's overcoat. Beside him, the city lights danced on the black water like scattered diamonds, but Dao couldn't appreciate the view. His mind was a frantic loop of surveillance photos in the cold, pragmatic shadow of the Vipers. He looked at Ella, who was leaning against the railing, her face serene and beautiful in the moonlight, and felt the familiar, heavy stone of his father's legacy settling in his chest. "This is beautiful," Ella breathed, her breath hitching in a small cloud of silver vapor. "Thank you for bringing me here, Dao." "Ella, we need to talk," he said, his voice sounding hollow, like a bell struck in a vacuum. The shift in his tone was immediate, and Ella turned, her smile faltering. "That sounds ominous," she said, her amber eyes searching his. "There are people in my world, enemies who have been watching us for weeks," Dao began, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. "They've been following you. They know you're the one thing I can't control with a bullet or a bribe. As long as you're with me, you have a target on your back every single second of every day." Ella's pace paled slightly, but she didn't look away. "Okay, so we're careful. We take precautions." "Careful isn't enough," Dao snapped, the desperation breaking through his polished exterior. "I'm saying maybe my mother was wrong. Maybe some people like me, aren't meant to let anyone in. I'm telling you to walk away, Ella, while you still can." The silence that followed was more painful than any physical blow. Ella stared at him, hurt flashing across her features before it hardened into a fierce, glowing defiance. "Are you breaking up with me, Dao Tan, or are you just trying to manage me like one of your shipping routes?" "I'm protecting you," he growled. "No, you're being a coward," she countered, her voice rising to meet the wind. "You're so used to controlling everything that you can't handle something real, something you can't command or threaten into submission. Your mother asked you to live, to actually feel something, and you're choosing to bury yourself alive because you're too scared to fight for what we have." "I am trying to keep you alive," he roared, his tattoos on his neck dark and jagged in the moonlight. "I don't want to be kept," Ella shouted back, tears finally streaming down her face. "I want to be chosen, but you'd rather die alone in your ivory tower than risk a single crack in your walls. If you want me gone, look me in the eye and tell me you don't love me. Otherwise, stop offering me exits and start showing me how to stay." Dao felt something inside him finally shatter. He reached for his phone as it buzzed in his pocket, a message from an unknown number containing a photo of Ella's apartment building. The reality of his world was staring him in the face, but for the first time, he didn't want to run back into the dark alone. The vibration of the phone against the metal railing felt like a death knell, the image of Ella's apartment building a cold reminder that the Shadow Vipers weren't interested in fair negotiations. Dao Tan stood frozen, the wind whipping his hair across his forehead, his eyes fixed on the screen as if he could shield her with his own gaze. He showed her the message, his voice hollow as he laid bare the reality of his existence. "This is what my world looks like, Ella. Every day, every moment. You want to be chosen? This is the price of that choice." Fear finally flickered in Ella's amber eyes, a sharp, cold realization of the predatory forces lurking in the periphery of her life. Her hand trembled as she looked at the photo, but she didn't step back. Instead, her chin lifted with a defiance that made Dao's heart stutter. "Then teach me," she whispered, her voice gaining strength. "Show me how to survive in your world, because I'm not walking away, unless you're too scared to let me try." The next 2 weeks were a blur of adrenaline and bruises. Dow's second-in-command, Cale, didn't approve of the arrangement, grumbling that putting a civilian in play was a strategic nightmare. But Dow's jaw remained set. If she stayed, she had to be untouchable. The training was intensive, held in a secluded gym where the smell of sweat and floor mats replaced the antiseptic of the hospital. Ella traded her scrubs for athletic gear, her natural curls dampened by effort as she learned to spot tails in a crowded street and vary her routes with the precision of a ghost. Dow watched her from the shadows of the gym, torn between a fierce pride and a sickening dread. He taught her how to leverage her weight, how to strike at the throat and eyes, and how to use tactical pens and encrypted devices his men carried. She didn't just learn to fight, she learned the politics of his empire, the delicate balance of shipping routes and territory that kept Seoul from exploding into open war. One evening, as she sat on the edge of a training ring nursing a fresh bruise on her shoulder, Dow approached with a cold compress. "You can still walk away," Dao Tan said, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "Stop offering me exits, Dao Tan," she said, leaning into his touch before pulling him into a fierce, claiming kiss. "I'm here. I chose this. I choose you." In the quiet of the gym, with the weight of the city pressing in from the outside, the Mafia boss realized he wasn't just protecting a nurse, he was building a partner who refused to see him as a monster. The call came at 4:12 a.m., a jagged vibration that shattered the silence of Dao Tan's office. He didn't need to see the caller ID to know the piece was over. A grainy video file appeared on his screen. Ella, her natural curls disheveled, her hands bound with zip ties, sitting in a chair against a backdrop of rusted corrugated metal. A voice, distorted and mocking, issued the ultimatum. "The Incheon shipping routes for the girl, boss. You have 3 hours before we start sending pieces of your heart back to you." Dao Tan didn't hesitate. He didn't weigh the cost of the territory or the millions in lost revenue. To his father, this would have been a catastrophic business failure. To Dao, it was a declaration of war against the only light he had left. "Cale, gather the unit," Dao commanded, his voice a low, lethal simmer. "We aren't negotiating. We're burning it down." The Shadow Viper's warehouse on the outskirts of the city was a fortress of concrete and shadow, but Dao Tan moved through it like a ghost made of vengeance. He didn't stay in the back behind his men, he led the breach, his luxury suit jacket discarded, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the dark ink of his forearms. The air exploded with the scent of cordite and the sharp crack of suppressed gunfire. Dao moved with a terrifying fluid precision, a human weapon finally unleashed. He neutralized 2 guards in the lobby with brutal efficiency, his movements a blur of the very tactics he had taught Ella weeks prior. When he finally kicked in the heavy steel door of the back office, he found the Viper leader holding a blade to Ella's throat. The man began to speak, likely a final attempt at leverage, but Dao didn't give him the breath. He moved faster than the eye could follow, a single decisive strike disarming the man before a secondary blow sent him crashing into the wall, unconscious before he hit the floor. Dao didn't look at the fallen enemy. He dropped to his knees in front of Ella, his hands trembling as he sliced through her restraints. "I'm here," he whispered, his forehead pressing against hers. "I've got you." Ella didn't crumble. Despite the terror of the last 3 hours, she looked at him with a fierce, steady gaze. "I used the move you taught me," she rasped, gesturing to a guard groaning on the floor behind her. "I delayed them." Dao pulled her into his arms, the scent of her hair grounding him in a way his empire never could. He had risked everything, his territory, his standing, the very foundation of his power, for a single woman. As his men moved in to secure the perimeter, Dao realized his mother's final gift hadn't been a person, but a choice. He had chosen love over iron, and for the first time, the most feared man in Seoul felt truly invincible.
6 months later, the morning sun over Gangnam didn't feel like a cold interrogation. It felt like a promise. Dao Tan stood on the balcony of their new apartment, the glass reflecting a man who still wore the weight of a city on his shoulders, but whose expression had lost its jagged, predatory edge. Below, the streets hummed with the familiar rhythm of commerce and chaos, yet the internal storm that had defined Dao's life for 15 years had finally settled into a wary, watchful calm. The Shadow Vipers were a memory, their hubris dismantled in the weeks following the warehouse raid. Dao had expanded his territory, his reputation now anchored by a frightening new clarity. He was a man who had everything to lose and the lethal means to protect it. Yet the true shift wasn't in the ledgers or the shipping manifests. It was inside the quiet walls of this home, decorated with Ella's vibrant touches and the framed black and white photographs of his mother's younger, healthier days. The coffee is ready, and stop brooding. It's too early for the Mafia scowl. Ella's voice drifted from the kitchen, warm and teasing. Dao turned as she walked toward him, her natural curls caught in the morning light, her presence a living testament to the risk they took every day. She stepped into his space, her hand resting against his chest, her touch a grounding wire that pulled him back from the darkness of his work. She didn't look at his neck tattoos with caution anymore. She traced them with the familiarity of someone who knew the man beneath the ink. "You're thinking about her again?" she said softly, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I'm thinking she was a better negotiator than I ever gave her credit for," Dao admitted, his arm wrapping around Ella's waist to pull her close. "She knew I was dying long before the cancer touched her. I just didn't realize the cure was standing in a hospital ward." "She saw your heart, Dao. She just needed someone to remind you where you kept it." He breathed in the scent of her, cocoa butter and home, and felt a rare, profound sense of peace. The world outside would always be dangerous, and the crown he wore would always be heavy, but he was no longer a weapon waiting for a hand to aim him. He was a man who had been chosen, and who had chosen in return. Some choices were dangerous, and some were worth every drop of blood spilled to keep them. As the city woke up around them, Dao Tan realized his mother hadn't just given him a nurse, she had given him a reason to survive the night.